There's a Chess 960 event taking place in St. Louis in the USA, the so-called Champions Showdown, which has attracted, well, some of the strongest players in the world, including Garry Kasparov, who says he's retired, but he seems to like to pop out now and again and get back to the board. I think this is a very safe event for him in some ways. He's very familiar with the St. Louis Chess Club and knows the people there very well. And of course, in a Chess 960 event, or Fischer Random, where the baseline pieces are shuffled, then he doesn't have to keep up with current theory. However, it is a risk for him because he's not match fit. This is the big problem. His knowledge is there, of course, but if you're not playing regularly, then that is a huge handicap, and you just don't have the speed of sight at the board that you would have in your proper playing days. Anyway, Kasparov is playing against Topalov, and although there are many other exciting matches going on, that's the match that I'd like to feature. Of course, it's fascinating to see how Kasparov gets on. So they played 2 rapid games, 2 game 30 games, and then 2 blitz games, 5 minutes, and they have increments as well. And I'd like to look at the second rapid game. The first rapid game was drawn. I'm also going to look at one of their blitz games afterwards as well, but here we go. Vasily Topalov with the white pieces. You can see, well, that this is the arrangement they have with the knights in the corner. That's maybe the weirdest thing about this position. I think the fact that castling is possible, as we'll see, makes this perhaps a slightly less unusual position. But anyway, the game certainly went into very unorthodox paths extremely quickly. C4 looks like a good start because that allows the queen to enter the game, and in fact there's a threat straight away of queen takes pawn. Now this occurred in quite a few of the matches actually, and a few players decided to give up that pawn as an opening gambit. It's also possible just to play the knight out to stop that capture. But Kasparov decided to gambit the pawn. Bravo, we like that. I mean, it looks completely crazy already, this position. In fact, black gets pretty good compensation because the queen has to retreat. Of course, the threat is to trap the queen. And black is already gaining a lot of time against the queen. Svidler Nakamura went queen c3 at this point, but Topalov played queen g3. And now an excellent move from Kasparov, which chips away at white's centre. This was also played in the game between Geary and So in round 3, and there Geary played b3, but well, also didn't get a great position. But Topalov took on b5 and queen b5. And now, watch out for this. Watch the king position and the rook position. Topalov now castled. Very strange. Which means his rooks are now connected. That's usually the point of castling. Of course, that pawn was pinned here as well. But the king isn't that safe on the king side, as we're about to see. But now we can see the point of playing b5, which was to gain the centre with d5. And black certainly has excellent compensation here. Huge centre. So far, Garry playing pretty well. And here is where I think his lack of match fitness told. Because he has a very simple move here, and it's an unusual move. Garry just simply didn't overlook this. Bishop a5 attacks the rook, and the only way to prevent that capture is to play b4, and black takes, but this is already very, very pleasant for black. It has a big centre. There's still a threat to play here, and white's pieces aren't very good. Instead, Kasparov played e4. His eye was drawn to another side of the board. Basically, he's threatening to play bishop c7. and potentially a mate on h2. And you can see that white's pieces just don't look very pleasantly placed here. Pawn takes pawn, so bishop c7 can be met by f4. So Kasparov recaptures, still the threat of bishop c7. So the queen switches, and king g8 just steps out of this line. It's interesting here, if Topalov wants to prevent bishop a5, let's say with bishop d2, in fact black gets an enormous attack here. Let me just show you a couple of possible variations. Queen switches back, and then knight f4, and you can see that with the queen way across the other side of the board, then we already have threats here on the king side that are very difficult to meet. That rook also, of course, plays a vital role, and those bishops also stand very well. They can enter into the attack at any moment. So that's why Topalov played his knight out. He didn't have time to prevent this strong move, bishop a5, but in fact he gets excellent compensation for the sacrifice of the exchange. We know that Topalov is famous for his exchange sacrifices, but I mean, I think this is all about the initiative, that black, in taking that material, actually had to invest time, and in that time white has managed to get some of his pieces into the game. And now you can see black's pieces somehow don't look very good. That knight on a8, very oddly placed. Once the attack is thwarted, then this rook also doesn't look terribly good on the h-file. And the lack of dark squared bishop, I think, tells, because this bishop isn't particularly good when it just hits this pawn. So knight b6 from Kasparov looks very reasonable to come here, so b3. In fact, I don't see anything wrong with just taking that pawn. Topalov was perhaps worried about the knight coming here, but in this case white is fine. But listen, in a rapid game, you just try to block out your opponent's pieces. You can't go into detail in calculation, and b3 of course is a pragmatic move. Now f5 looks like the way to go. Perhaps Gary should have had the courage of his convictions and just played like this and gone for an attack. But instead he went knight d5. I think in this game he really does show his rustiness, because white is gaining control here. I don't see anything wrong with queen a7, because that would prevent the queen coming back. But instead Topalov plays absolute safety first. He wants to make sure that he gets rid of Kasparov's queen. You can see the pin there. So Kasparov has to allow an exchange, go for the exchange. So Topalov has a bishop and a pawn against a rook, but black's pieces are not very well placed, in particular the rook on h8. And white is about to coordinate pretty well. I don't see what's wrong with just moving this pawn. And then I would say, well, white has certainly adequate compensation for the... Well, in fact, it's bishop and 2 pawns against the rook. I forgot these double pawns. I'd say chances are balanced, basically. But yeah, I think Garrett should just save the pawn. But instead, he sort of rushed in with his pieces. So it's the kind of move that looks very attractive. But in fact, Veselin now manages to coordinate his pieces extremely well. You can see that, well, in fact, all white's pieces stand well here. Again, I think a6 would be best, but Gary is trying to coordinate his pieces, get some activity. But after this, white certainly stands very well, and taking that pawn is crucial. And now it's absolutely clear that white stands well. He has Now, a knight and 3 pawns for a rook, and that passed a pawn is just waiting to step forward. The knight on d3 looks very impressive, but in fact, after this move, undermining that piece, then it's quite clear that Gary is in massive trouble. So he's trying to connect his rooks. But the problem is, actually, even once they come into the game, they don't have very much to do. Because it's one of those situations where white's pieces all have firm posts. They're very secure. You can see that here. So actually, this is a very, very pleasant position for white to play. And here it's quite clear that Kasparov is lost. He was also a little bit short of time as well. So that was a factor in this game, that, you know, he was fighting against the clock because he's ring rusty, basically. Good move from Topalov. So he's just shuffled his pieces around. Of course, rook takes pawn, be met by a check, a fork. h3 drives the knight away. And in this position, Kasparov resigned after a6. I think very understandable. He was very short of time. And really, there's not a lot that black can do here. The pawn is going to come to a7. And, well, little by little, white will creep forward. There's, you know, obviously moves like this. Probably the best that black has is to play the rook to a8. And to give up rook for bishop and enter into a rook and pawn endgame. But this is just a matter of time, of course. Completely winning position. White has 3 extra pawns here. So, well, an unusual game, certainly. And both sides trying to play for the initiative. But Gary didn't quite click here. He didn't quite get it together. He was trying very hard to get something together on the king side, but Topalov, I think, you know, played a couple of key moves there and was alert to the attack. And yeah, he managed to coordinate very well on the queen side. So I think certainly a very deserved victory for Vasily Topalov, and Gary Kasparov showing signs in these early games that he's not quite there. But I want to show you one more game. You'll see that in the next video. I'm going to show you one of their blitz games. They played 2 blitz games after this. So do check out the next video.